It's done. It started live streaming on YouTube.
Yes, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I once again welcome you all to the 5th International Deluge and Guattari Studies in India International Conference. So now we begin with non-plenary session 2. The title of this session is Life, Nihilism and Beyond. This session will be chaired by Dr. Amin Gorgul. And before we begin with the session, I'll like to read out a brief bio of Amin Gorgul. Amin Gorgul is an associate professor and a tenured faculty of Istanbul Technical University, School of Architecture, actively taking part both in graduate and undergraduate levels of architecture and interior architecture programs, and former vice chair of Department of Interior Architecture. She has received her BSc, MSc, and PhD degrees from ITU on architecture and architectural theory and criticism. Her master thesis focused on deconstructivism and avant-garde theory, while dismantling the avant-garde behavior in deconstructivism. Yet, her PhD thesis entitled Space as a Becoming, a discussion on transfiguring ontology of space and emergence of spatial mediators, also focused on the space as an open-ended dynamic embodiment and examining the architectural space through a delusion context. She was a visiting researcher in Tretiakov Galleries and State Russian Museum, a visiting scholar in DSDTU Delft, a visiting teacher at AA Architectural Association London, VTP, and invited studio critic in Hong Kong University School of Architecture, visiting professor in CADC Auburn University, Alabama, and guest lecturer in ENSA Versailles. She has been the chair of Deluge Studies Conference Istanbul 2014 and also keynote presenters and camp tutors of many Deluge Studies conferences. She teaches not only design studios, but also theoretical courses focusing on architectural theory and criticism, space and politics, gender and space, as well as design culture. She has authored numerous articles and book chapters, both in Turkish and in English. Last but not the least, among many other funded research projects, she is the recent winner of Turkey's one of the most prestigious research prizes founded by KOC University and VEKM with her project entitled Entertainment Policies, Modern Subjectivities and Leisure Culture, the effect of Köpük Dam and its gazebo in Ankara's leisure culture. Over to you, ma'am.
Oh, thank you so much, Nivedita. Hello for everyone. It's so great to be with you. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers pulling us all into this great event, initially to dearest Manoj, and then to dearest Menu and George. I think he's not online right now. So it's great to be here with you online and joining the session from Istanbul. Like announced on the second non-plenary session of today, we have two presenters, though it has been scheduled for 3, but we will have John Dimopoulos and dear Evrim Bayındır as the presenters. So we'll initially begin with John. I would like to announce him initially and give a brief information about him. John Dimopoulos is a multidisciplinary researcher, activist, and freelance architect based in Athens. He's a PhD candidate in School of Architecture of the National University of Athens. His thesis entitled Objectology researches the philosophy of hypermodern design and possible radical alternatives to current design methodologies, both in architecture and disciplines. He is also currently doing a second undergraduate master degree in sculpture at the Athens School of Fine Arts. His research interests include hypermodern culture, utopian and dystopian imaginary and design, social subjectivity, bodily methods in space and the arts. He has experienced as teaching assistant and as a guest lecturer in undergraduate and postgraduate courses in National Technical University of Athens. And his practice spans architecture, painting, sculpture, philosophy, fantasy literature, poetry, and contemporary dance. So the floor is yours, and then I would announce everybody when he starts his presentation. So we have around half an hour for your presentation.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thank you everyone for you can hear me, right?
Yes, please
Okay.
carry on. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you everyone for putting this conference together, and I'm gonna try and get right to it. First of all, I presented some of this work yesterday in an informal gathering between some colleagues, philosophers, etc. And I got bashed pretty hard for being too unsystematic. So I'm happy to have an architecture teacher as a chair. I think I'm gonna get pretty light. I'm gonna get away with a lot of things. So so maybe the first issue I wanna just start with, put out there, is my title. I chose a neologism. So objectology, of course, is a term I devised, kind of, and I often feel like when you bring your own term to the table, you kind of have to explain why you're doing that instead of using one of the already existing ones. And I hope that this is going to be kind of apparent by the end of my presentation, but I'm gonna give some preliminary comments on this. First of all, I think that that it is unavoidable today, especially when we want to talk about technology and its relation to humanity in general. When we want to talk about life, artificial or natural, material, immaterial, etc., I think that we can't really avoid the philosophical issue of the object. And I think that this is probably the basis reason why I chose to include it on my title, because I really think that the issue of the object is not just about metaphysics anymore, as maybe it was when Heidegger first introduced a modern approach to the object. Of course, approaches to the object as a philosophical issue are much older. Descartes, of course, ancient Greek philosophers, Parmenides, whatever. But I think that Heidegger was the first one to put it in a modern context. And I think that we can't really avoid it if we want to cut deep. So why am I speaking about objects and why am I choosing objects? I think that objects are a very good intermediary category, or maybe an intermediary entity, if one wants to approach some very big issues in design and sociology today from several lenses. I think that you can approach the issue of the object from a scientific perspective, a philosophical perspective, design-wise, and I think that it links technology, metaphysics, design, art, even everyday experience somehow. And that's why I think it's a very fruitful term to use in this particular case. So I'm going to maybe give a general overview of what objectology is all about at first, and I hope that by the end, when I give my full explanation regarding to it, I'm gonna have you convinced. So my project actually has to do and this presentation actually has to do with an inquiry into the philosophy of design of the 21st century. And I think that this is a major issue because design as a practice is getting broader and broader. And a series of thinkers and philosophers and researchers have commented on this. I'm going to briefly present some of their arguments further on, beginning with Bruno Latour, going on into Harman and object-oriented ontology. Maybe I'll have time to throw in a little bit of Peter Sloterdijk in there. And I find that this proposition is, as a basis for discussion, I think it's actually valid. So I'm gonna try and begin with a few rough, maybe ontological distinctions regarding object and similar categories, so that I have a floor to introduce the whole argument into how Latour puts it, which I feel is a very good introduction for how things are today, actually. And I'm gonna try and go on from there. So, beginning with Heidegger's analysis on objects, maybe his tool analysis, I think, is the most precise of all, and the collective tome with all his lectures regarding things, etc. What is a thing? He very early on he makes a distinction between objects and things, and Heidegger, of course, being preoccupied with the being of everything, with being, or how things are presented in the world, how they're emerging in the world, how they authentically exist, etc. Of course, makes the distinction on the basis of being first and foremost, and the difference in being between an object and a thing is that an object appears as ready at hand, what Heidegger terms Zuhandene, and things appear as present, or what Heidegger terms as Vorhandene. And actually, I think that behind the lines of maybe a deep metaphysical distinction here is actually it's about an attitude towards technology and towards the user of a certain artifact or a physical entity. And that's why Heidegger goes on to distinguish even further and state that the object is something that is usually industrially designed for a specific purpose, with a specific user in mind and with a specific use. And that's why it's somehow closed to interpretation. Its being is kind of sterile. It does what it can do, and that's just about it. While a thing exists in a broader matrix of relations, social, in a network of relations, as we would say in modern terms. And a very common distinction between objects and things, a very common anecdotal example used in bibliography often, is the distinction between a Coca-Cola bottle or a Coca-Cola can, which is an object. It's something designed by a professional industrial designer. It's created in a factory. It's used for a specific purpose, etc., etc. And the picture that Heidegger's grandfather used to have on his coffee table, which could be a vase, it could be a decorative item, it could be a pitcher to pour water or wine or beer or whatever. And it was also a memento, an item of memory. So that's a very common distinction, which I hope I'm going to show is kind of problematic. So beginning with Heidegger, and I wouldn't want to dwell too much on this, I think that his whole premise in a contemporary context can actually have some very difficult issues to solve. And maybe the first one is that it is very, very anthropocentric. So that's not a problem ideologically. It's a problem when novel categories of things, metaphysical categories, design categories, practices arise that cannot be solely handled through an anthropocentric lens. And that's readily apparent when one thinks of artificial intelligence, for example. It's not easy to speak of artificial intelligence philosophically when you have the human in the foreground in an undisputed way. And a second problem with this premise is I think that the boundaries between object and thing tend to get a lot more blurry today. And I'm going to get back to this example of the Coca-Cola can and Heidegger's grandfather's pitcher, because I think that most of us here can very easily argue that a Coca-Cola bottle actually has a huge amount of social connotations, has a huge amount of maybe lived experiences attached to it, and it is part of a very large network of relations, unlike what industrial objects are presented in Heidegger's thought. And finally, I think that there are categories and maybe novel kinds of realities that really can't be addressed with Heidegger's whole idea of being, such as augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality. It's very difficult to speak about authentic being when there are all these different kinds of beings or quasi-beings coming into the foreground. So Latour actually accepts much of this critique I'm putting on Heidegger. I think that much of this is a widely recognized problem, and so Latour tries to move a little bit further, and I think that he even takes it upon himself to somehow try and salvage technology from a technophobic attitude, which is very common. It was very common in the late 20th century. It's very common in the 21st century, and rightly so. I mean, it's understandable why there's a technophobic attitude. Surveillance capitalism, climate change, etc. So Latour tries to go a little bit further, and I think he's being very political about it when he claims that, according to his opinion, design is one of the terms that tends to replace the word revolution in the 21st century. Well, I disagree with that personally, both politically and ideologically, but I think that we have to take it seriously and look upon what is the underlying implication of his statement, which is exactly that design has to do with a lot more things. It's a lot broader than it used to be, and we can think of many more things as designable. And he makes this list of things that we can think of as designed today, which couldn't be thought of as designed or designable in the past, such as genes, climate, subjectivity, apart from actual physical objects and technological artifacts and so on. And I think that what Latour gets to with all his analysis is actually a premise which I think is kind of misplaced, which is that in the 21st century, according to his opinion, we're moving away from objects and closer to things. And I think he states that because he's trying to highlight that anything physical, material or immaterial, any kind of object really, is embedded in a vast network of design of social relations, of political relations, of aesthetic relations, and so on, as I mentioned before with the Coca-Cola bottle. But that doesn't make it a thing altogether. And he has this very inventive argument using the Proto-Germanic and ancient Scandinavian terms "thing" and "all thing," which mean an assembly. And he's trying to make an analogy between how things today tend to have a lot of connections and with the way an assembly works. So he's imagining a kind of democratization of human relations to things and objects, which I think is more or less false. And I'm going to pose two objections to it, which I think can make my argument a little bit clearer. So if we are indeed moving from objects into things, and there is a democratization of relationships between animate and inanimate actors, I think that we cannot really account for and we cannot really explain how mass production of industrial objects or an industrialization of objects which were previously not mass produced is occurring today. I mean, apart from the immense quantity of industrial objects par excellence, I think that this mode of thought and this mode of design passes into other fields as well, and architecture is a very prominent example. I think that if you take a closer look at the very, very famous architectural practices of Renzo Piano, Zaha Hadid, Frank Gehry, they have very recognizable forms which they use in all of their buildings, and they tend to produce them in a large quantity and a large scale. And it was a revelation to me when here in Athens, the Renzo Piano building workshop designed and built the SNFCC, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Cultural Center. And it was actually the topic of my undergraduate diploma project. And I discovered that the Renzo Piano building workshop has actually designed and built two nearly identical buildings in the last 10 years. One of them is a library in Chicago, and the other is a gallery in Torino, I think. I'm not sure, somewhere in Italy. So that's the first objection. And the second objection is that if there is really a democratization occurring, we can't account for how it's progressively more difficult to think technological artifacts as radically redesignable. We tend to think of technological artifacts in particular as something given, which cannot really change. Its basic form cannot really change. Its basic function, its systemic design qualities cannot really change. And a very good example on this is the smartphone. The smartphone is actually a device which has been proven to be very bad for children in terms of their focus and the way it addicts the user to this dopamine surge caused by the constant scrolling. And this is also true for adults. And there is actually an engineer who used to work for Xiaomi. He's a Chinese engineer who designed a smartphone in the shape of a cube. It's unscrollable. There's no screen, you can't scroll, but it holds the same number of functions and the same computing power, the same memory, etc. It just can't be scrolled. You can't fidget with it. And this could be argued to be a solution to a great many deal of problems regarding the smartphone and its implications, which would never be adopted by any company, I think. And the reason why it would never be adopted is not that it doesn't solve problems. It's because they don't really want this problem solved. They want the smartphone to be addicting, and they want us to use it in the way they have thought it should be used. So we can't really imagine a smartphone without a scrollable screen, a wide screen anymore. And that's another argument on why objects tend to be more firm today rather than and more undemocratic rather than more democratic. So Latour maybe is seeing something when he tries to speak about how objects go into things. And I think what we should give him credit for is that the boundary is really getting progressively blurrier. We can't really distinguish so hard between objects and things, really not like Heidegger did. But I think that the reason for this is that actually the object-thing dichotomy it tends a little bit more to a dialectic nowadays. These are two facets that every artificial item and maybe even people have from time to time regarding on their actual current state. So I think we could be speaking about an object 2.0 as a, you know, we need, I think, a metaphysical overhaul of the concept of the object. Of course, I can't really do that. I'm not a philosopher, but I think it would be a fertile ground for research, theoretical research. And it also, I hope it somehow becomes apparent how using objects in a certain way and the way objects are shaped today really has to do a lot with how their users are shaped today. So having to do with an object 2.0 also has to do with the subject 2.0. You need the new type of object to have a new type of user or produce this new type of user if the user is not really here just yet. So I'm going to try and dig a little deeper on this issue, and I'm going to utilize a category which I think is a novel category. It's a category of objects 2.0 par excellence today, and that's the concept of the hyperobject. And hyperobject is a concept first seen in speculative realism and object-oriented ontology in the Graham Harman team, Graham Harman crowd. And I think the first one to mention it was, or use the term was Timothy Morton, who is of course very ecologically minded, and he used it to describe objects which are very, very durable, which can wildly outlast human presence on Earth, for instance, such as styrofoam cups or radioactive plutonium, which take thousands of years to decompose and change, and which can really be a game changer in regards to ecology, waste management, etc. And he has a very nice quote, which I'm going to use when he refers to hyperobject. He says that hyperobjects appear more real than reality itself. They're like the acidic blood of the alien in Ridley Scott's film, which burns through metal floors. This blood is a science fiction version of demonic ichor. And I think this is a very spot-on description, because it speaks about something which is designed, many times it's immaterial, because of course, not just styrofoam cups or radioactive plutonium are hyperobjects, even though one could argue that radioactive plutonium is not really fully material, but which, however, have a very real and very material impact on the world. And another very famous example of a hyperobject is the internet, which is not really tangible. It has a vast scale. You can't really fathom it as a totality, but which shapes our everyday reality. It shapes our habits, the way we interact, we connect, the way we form social bonds, etc. And if I'm trying to extrapolate a definition of hyperobjects of my own, I would say that hyperobjects are objects which are fully or partly artificial, which exceed human scope. And they exceed human scope in size, breadth, time span, durability, impact, and most of all, which is something I think that Timothy Morton doesn't stress enough, interconnectivity, their ability to form connections, horizontal connections throughout social networks, ecological networks, habitats, theoretical networks, philosophically, and in any field really. And what I think that hyperobjects have that is a game changer today is this immense interconnectivity, but also the scale at which they exist, which poses very real, very material issues for us as designers, as philosophers, as humans, as people in general. And one of the biggest issues regarding hyperobjects is the infrastructure they demand. The infrastructure demanded for the internet to function, or for electricity to be distributed everywhere in homes everywhere around the world, or for clean water to be distributed all around the world, road networks, etc. This infrastructure is so immense, and it takes such a huge amount of time and effort to maintain and to repair. But that's not the whole of the story. I mean, we could really argue that industrial age infrastructure of the 19th century was also very demanding in terms of the time it took to maintain and repair. I think the real change here is that much of the infrastructure of hyperobjects relies on other hyperobjects. And this is actually a loop from which you can very easily easily get tangled in. And a prime example of this is how deglitching and correction of algorithms works nowadays. When programmers at Google or Facebook or one of these mega corporations with the huge servers and immense calculating power have to solve a problem, for instance, on Google search algorithm, they rely on other huge, immense programs to point them to the right direction, and they can never really have a view of the whole thing. No one knows exactly how Google search algorithm works. And when you try to maintain it and solve an issue that has come up, most of the times you rely on a diagnostics program, and then you rely on an addition to each algorithm. You create an addition which solves the symptom and not, in most cases, the root cause. And this, I think, is a paradigm shift in regards to how humans and technology interacts, and what we can extrapolate about objects and the subjects that they produce. Another very famous example is Google's AI, which was around 2017, I think. It managed to program other AIs of its own in a process which was absolutely opaque, and about which the initial programmers which created the Google AI had no clue. They couldn't really know how it did this. They don't have access to the steps the Google AI took in order to create these branch AIs, and these branch AIs, very interestingly so, score a lot better than human-created AIs on on tests regarding how close they are to, yeah. Okay, so my time is over. I'm gonna just repeat one last sentence. I think that all of this, all of what I've been trying to say makes a little bit more apparent why we would need a new novel theory of the object, and a theory which is also very, very tightly connected to a design practice. We need to understand how objects today are designed in order to be able to pose alternatives to this design, which are ultimately alternatives to modes of life. That's all. I'm sorry for taking a little bit longer.
No, you're perfectly wrapped up very rapidly. Thank you so much for this mind-opening discussion, and probably we would extend it with during the Q&A with further questions. So thank you so much, dear John. And I would like to pursue with the second presenter of the session today, Mr. Evrim Bayındır. Evrim, I cannot see you. Well, yeah. So Evrim Bayındır is a PhD student in philosophy at Royal Holloway, University of London, and a researcher in critical philosophy at the New Center for Research and Practice. His research interests focus on philosophies of Kant, Nietzsche, Husserl, Heidegger, Levinas, Deleuze, Irigaray, and contemporary realist ontologies, with a special emphasis on the concept of temporality, spatiality, origin, nihilism, consciousness, domination, and autonomization. He is also working on the philosophical consequences of deep listening practices in relation to composers such as Debussy, Messiaen, Bol, Xenakis, Oliveros, and Gubaidulina. Sorry for my pronunciations in between. Evrim, over to you if you're ready.
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you, Emine.
Pleasure.
Before starting, I would like to say that this presentation is a very rough summary of the 10,000 words paper, which is itself a sketch of a larger PhD project. And I had extreme difficulty in reducing this into a 20 minutes presentation. So the audience might find a number of unclear leaps and inconsistencies. Sorry for this. And if you are interested in the topic, please feel free to write to me and I will be happy to share with you the full paper. In Nietzschean philosophy, Deleuze posits the collapse of nihilism as a fully autonomous process, which means that nihilism will be defeated by itself, not by us. The paradox of Deleuze's Nietzsche-influenced attempts to overcome nihilism is that his philosophy cannot create the concept of autonomy required to think the self-defeat of nihilism. This can be detected in the way he fetters the collapse of nihilism to agents such as the passive nihilist, the man who wants to perish, and the overman. The collapse of nihilism cannot be thought without making it pass through an agent or a type. Hence, nihilism's self-defeat becomes indistinguishable from the self-defeat of man. Therefore, Deleuze's project of the overcoming of nihilism cannot think of its results, which is the actual collapse of nihilism, as an event taking place irrespective of those who strive to accomplish it. Both Nietzsche and Deleuze imagine nihilism as something that they have overcome on a philosophical level, but which has not been actualized yet. The matter is not whether they have overcome nihilism, rather the very image of nihilism as something that can be overcome by us is wrong. I would like to suggest that the speculative realist movement, which attempts to think a reality that is autonomous from the correlation between thinking and the real, provides the resources to create the concept of autonomy that is absent in Deleuze. My aim is thus to inject the autonomy revealed by speculative realism into the self-defeat of nihilism. More specifically, I will make use of Ray Brescier's nihilist version of speculative realism in Nihil Unbound, which defines the real beyond the correlation as the traumatic death of thinking and life. According to Brescier, Deleuze's tethering of the overcoming of nihilism to an agent's self-overcoming arises from the very logic of his anti-nihilism. Brescier argues that once philosophy is determined as the affirming instance and life as the object of affirmation, thinking is necessarily endowed with an infinite power to affirm. The problem here is not with Deleuze's aim of liberating life from the authority of a transcendent instance, but with the unintended side product as the eternalization or the immortalization of thinking, which is characteristic of all previous idealist and correlationist philosophy. Deleuze's affirmationism performs this by transforming Freud's material model of death, where the subject instinctually struggles to merge with matter, into the eternal return of difference. This is how death is reduced to a function of thinking, and negation into a power of affirmation. In opposition to Deleuze's vitalist subordination of death, Brescier fully embraces nihilism as a speculative opportunity to think according to the future extinction or the death of thinking. However, contrary to Brescier's self-avowed nihilism, I will consider the death of thinking as a continuation of the death of God and man, which are determined by Deleuze as necessary stages towards the overcoming of nihilism. While Brescier is right in criticizing Deleuze for the immortalization of thought, it is questionable if this should entail a defense of nihilism. It might well be possible that the death of thinking can serve as a means to accomplish Deleuze's projects in a way that has not been foreseen by Deleuze himself. To do this, I will make use of the distinction Deleuze makes between active and reactive forces in Nietzschean philosophy. I will suggest that through the idea of the death of thinking, Brescier introduces a new reactive force, which is the binding of extinction, and which allows us to think of the collapse of nihilism as an autonomous event. But before coming to this, let me briefly explain how Deleuze demonstrates the development of reactive forces throughout the history of nihilism. Deleuze writes that the emergence of nihilism depends on purely material relations between reactive forces. But where do these reactive forces come from in the first place? Deleuze finds the answer in Freud's topical hypothesis, which refers to the original traumatic events that enabled the distinction between inside and outside, by means of which we distinguish between thinking and the real. The burst of excitation released in this original split forces the organism to simultaneously construct a consciousness as a reactive force that can receive the excitations, and a memory as a second reactive force that records the transformations. However, Deleuze does not follow the conclusions that Freud derived from the topical hypothesis, which he deems incapable of giving an account of what a true activity is and how these reactions can be subordinated to active forces. According to Deleuze, the production of memory and consciousness is followed by their autonomization from the domination of active forces. Once these reactive forces escape from active forces, they start to act autonomously and serve as the pure matter for the nihilistic imposition of form, this form being the idea of a world beyond, God being the in itself or the real. This represents the negative nihilism, which is the mystification of a world beyond made by using the matter of reactive forces that previously escaped active forces. Here, negation or nihilism reigns over the reactive forces out of which it is fabricated and makes use of reactive forces in order for life to contradict itself. Concordantly, it is by way of their obedience to negation that reactive forces consolidate their authority over active forces. In reactive nihilism, however, the complicity between reactive forces and negation is revealed to be provisional and strategic. Once they become mature enough to stand on their own, human beings kill God and ascend to his throne. Reactive forces hence create an image of existence that is fully penetrated by their resentments in the absence of a transcendent power to rule over them. Man thus represents the juncture where all forces become reactive. However, reactive forces soon become aware of the impossibility of invading the real or the traumatic abyss of existence that is opened after the death of God. In the last form, which is passive nihilism, reactive forces get stuck in a somewhat purgatory state, wherein they cannot but hope for extinction and let themselves fade away passively. The crucial upshot of this final stage is that passive extinction leaves behind a negation that neither rules over reactive forces, nor can it be possessed by them. Having lost its contact with life, there remains nothing for this autonomous negation to negate other than reactive forces. Since man represents the becoming reactive of all forces, the negation of reactive forces should necessarily bring forth the negation or the death of man. This is what Deleuze calls the self-defeat of nihilism, which is proven to be an autonomous event arising necessarily from the logic of the history of nihilism and which owes nothing to active forces and affirmation. Nevertheless, negation has to be attached to an already reactive agent, which leaves the self-defeat of nihilism to the vagaries of the agent's free will. Deleuze's solution lies in a shift from negation to affirmation that hopes to bypass this indeterminacy. This shift irreversibly abolishes the autonomy of negation by subordinating it to the superior autonomy of affirmation or by making it a power of affirmation. However, such a sharp transition is possible only if we presuppose that all reactive forces can be correlated to man and all active forces to overman. The death of man entails that he is not in a privileged position with respect to life and thinking. But one wonders, why would he be in a privileged position with respect to reactive forces? And how such a strict overlapping of man and all reactive forces would not reproduce the same anthropocentrism, albeit in a negative form. We might thus ask if there are reactive forces that are not human, and what perspective they might offer with regard to the self-defeat of nihilism. It is in this context that we can relate Bresciar's speculative nihilism to Deleuze's historical schema, as it will offer us not only a superior negation, but also an inhuman and non-correlational reactive force. According to Bresciar, the reality that is autonomous from thinking is expressed in the plain scientific statements concerning the irreversible destruction of matter or the future extinction of the universe. Since thinking cannot exist without its material support, extinction entails the death of thinking as well. The simplicity of the scientific statements harbors a surprising fundamental equivocality, because it overturns the distinction between origin and ends. That the universe will irreversibly be annihilated suggests that it has always already been annihilated, that we are always already dead. One could say that there is still a difference between the now, in which thinking is always already dead, and the future, that it is going to be terminally destroyed. But the whole point of extinction is to have always already cancelled the distinction between now and future, rendering the now of my being always already dead identical with its future actualization or empirical instantiation. Bresciar argues that extinction is a reiteration of Freud's original trauma, which Deleuze crucially bypassed in his discussion on the material and pre-nihilistic stage of reactive forces. This reiteration is a cosmological reinscription of the death drive that Freud determined as the tendency of organic life to dissolve into primordial inorganic matter. In this desire to identify with inert matter, the Freudian subject strives to bind the overabundant excitation released in the traumatic fracture. However, this attempt is deemed to be unsuccessful because of the very traumatic nature of the event, which entails that it has never been experienced. Trauma is not a function of experience. It can only be detected as a malfunction. The very fact that experience can be interrupted only by trauma and not by experience itself proves that trauma is real. But what is deeper is that the real can be conceived of only as trauma. Bresciar affirms this traumatic conception of reality and applies Freud's concept of binding to his own idea of extinction. He thereby advances the binding of the original trauma into the binding of extinction as future trauma. The traumatic real is thus discerned not only in the interruption, but also in the full annihilation of experience along with life and thinking. The task of philosophy as nihilism then becomes the binding of extinction, or to be the organon of extinction, in order to think thinking's death. Nihilism is no longer the dominance of reactive forces that oppose life, but a practice of binding the extinction, so that the so-called immortality of thinking can be overthrown. Deleuze's eternal return, on the other hand, presupposes an irrealism that subordinates biophysical or material death to the eternal return as intensive death. This intensive death introduces an eternity that is reflected into itself in the form of the self-affirmation of affirmation. For Bresciar, this is another way of repeating the Hegelian thesis that, quote, being is coextensive with the act of its own reflexive self-positive, end quote. And the ultimate difference Deleuze makes is to propose a vitalist inversion of Hegel, where difference in itself is converted into difference for itself. Deleuze's equation of a self-affirming or self-differentiating difference with the in itself is only a manner of canceling the in itself altogether. Despite differences, it is important to see that for both Deleuze and Bresciar, nihilism testifies to a series of extreme autonomizations. In Deleuze, as noted above, this begins with the autonomization of reactive forces from active forces. Furthermore, the end of nihilism comes with a second separation, namely the separation of negation from reactive forces. While for Deleuze, the separated negation has nowhere to go and is destined to be subordinated to affirmation, for Bresciar, it has to go far beyond that, to the point at which it becomes separated not merely from reactive forces, which are still expressions of a certain mode of life, but more importantly, from the human thinking and life. What is crucial here is that this new negation is not an advanced version of the same negation of which Deleuze speaks. While Deleuze's autonomous negation is primarily a mystification created by reactive forces, which is then transformed into a power of affirmation, Bresciar's negation is directly related to the original trauma, which is prior to the material or pre-nihilistic stage of reactive forces. Rather than following what comes after the historical struggles and complicities between reactive forces and negation, Bresciar thus goes back to the materiality prior to reactive forces and connects it to the ultimate annihilation of matter as such. Bresciar's extinction is thus a sneaky one. It is not added to the history of nihilism as a successive stage, but transpierces from its prehistory to an apocalyptic future by endowing nihilism with a positive capacity to question the authority of thought. The speculative form of nihilism must function not merely as a new form that cumulatively advances and expands this history, but as a deforming element, which invites us to recast the relations of forces. The reactive quality of Bresciar's binding can be understood in its relationship to Freud's own notion of binding. While Freud's binding is a reaction to the original trauma, Bresciar's binding is capable of reacting to extinction as the original trauma's repetition. As Deleuze shows, Freud's binding is a reactive force that belongs to a human subject. It is a force of preservation which knows only how to resentfully oppress the burst of vital excitation or to react to an activity. Besides, as he later shows in Difference and Repetition, binding's reaction is an integration of scattered differences of excitation in order to form an ego. Bresciar's binding, by contrast, does not react to an original activity in order to integrate differences into an ego. On the contrary, it reacts to a negation unforeseen by the history of nihilism and effectuates a disintegration of thoughts. The movement in which it participates is not an illusion created by resentments, and unlike the reactive forces of passive nihilism, its image of extinction is not that of a docile fading away, but rather that of an opportunity for a courageous attempt to conceive of thinking as a perishable object. To conclude, I would like to point out that, surprisingly, not much has been said about the fact that the consequences that Bresciar derives from his nihilism are far from his mainstream image as bleak or pessimistic. Redefining nihilism as the effectuation of the real's non-correlational separation from thinking renders not only real, but also nihilism indifferent to thinking and life. Nihilism cannot separate the real from thinking without separating itself from life. It is through nihilism that negation stops being the negation of life. For Bresciar, this is the only way to fully abolish the fideism, religion, idealism, and spiritualism that are sustained ever more cunningly within the vitalist affirmationism that purports to leave them behind. Nihilism thus can be said to accomplish affirmation's aim better than affirmation itself. The self-defeat of nihilism does not start, as Deleuze writes, when negation destroys reactive forces by inciting in man, and only in man, the desire for self-destruction, but when reactive forces become inhuman and begin to react to extinction. For Deleuze, the problem with nihilism was its autonomization. For Bresciar, nihilism becomes the tool for thinking the autonomous. Reading the two together allows us to approach the moments when the autonomy of the self-defeat of nihilism is not an autonomy among others, but autonomy as such. It is at this point that we might start to investigate how nihilism defeats itself, irrespective of the actions of a self-overcoming agent. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Evan. That's super insightful. Okay, I would like to open the session to questions. Are there any questions from the audiences on the online? I would like to extend the sincere thanks to both presenters for their insightful presentations. Maybe before taking the audience's questions while they're preparing, I would like to reflect two questions for each presenter, if it's possible. I see that there are no questions appearing on the chat, neither hands are rising. So I use this time to reflect my questions. Initially, to John, being as an architect, and when he was discussing about this notion of hyper-objectivity, I was using the notion of objectile and transitiveness in my work, PhD work thesis. But when you keep on explaining your perspective of hyper object, I immediately, in relation to the durability or re-emergence of the materiality, I immediately think the notion of spolia and the technique of spolia, and how we can readapt this notion into your work. And I think it could be something super challenging in order to redefine this attitude in the contemporary age of technology, if we consider the notion of technology. And secondly, so I give you the word each by each. So secondly, when Evrim was explaining during his presentation, I immediately tried to reconnect the dichotomy of mind and body in Descartes, Cartesian third, and how this could be reread through your perspective, or the opposite way of breaking this dichotomy. And beyond that, I was also thinking the notion of affect and where it stands in the process of binding processes of nihilism. So both are super mind-opening for me. I would like to thank a lot. So maybe, John, we start with you and then receive Evrim's feedback, and meanwhile watch for the questions from the audience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, both for your comments and your questions. Objectile, I think objectile is also a very fruitful category in design, and I think that a very interesting enterprise would be to try and devise a phenomenology of objects from the perspective of design, solely from the perspective of design. And this could contain hyper objects, of course. It could contain objectiles. It could contain non-objects, of which I didn't have time to speak, and which are a term Sloterdijk uses in relation to Thomas Macho and psychoanalysis and so on, which, especially non-objects, I think they're very, very, very useful when trying to think of alternative design processes. And transitiveness, which is an identifying element of objectiles, could really form also a very powerful dichotomy there. How maybe, in analogy to how I described objects and things, tend to become interchangeable and form a dialectic process changing between each other, I think that hyperobjects and objectiles also could form a similar dichotomy, a similar dialectic, better, not dichotomy, dialectic. And a very good example of this is how, while the internet is massive, it extends everywhere, it has immense amount of information, electrical power that it uses, servers, infrastructure, etc. Wi-Fi is so very fickle. You can never really be too sure about having a secure Wi-Fi connection, and this is a kind of maybe an intangible objectile, the way Wi-Fi networks function. And this is actually a very, very insightful question and comment, and I think I'm definitely going to use it. I would love to see, of course, your thesis, if it contains more on this, and of course quote you on it. So thank you for that. And regarding spolia, I think that spolia have a very specific social connotation to them. They're the spoils of war. Apart from their the way they're designed and their function and so on, and this idea of spoils of war, I think it accentuates even more the conundrum which design and its social production is in today. Even if one were to take, the Legend Guattari's analysis of the war machines and the apparatus of capture and so on, and maybe extend the concept of war to class struggle or into design struggles or aesthetic struggles, this idea of spoils, in a way, I think the way we update our social media pages takes this notion of spoils and transforms it into something else, into a way we form our subjectivity actually. So when I take a trip, the photo I have from the trip, my selfies or the landscapes or the landmarks or whatever are virtual spoils of this trip, and I use them to decorate my facade, which is my Facebook page, for instance, or my Instagram page or whatever. And that's why the identity formed from these pages is at the same time very fragmentary, but also very robust. It's even more robust than the actual person. I mean, no one is as happy or as one-dimensional as they're presented in their social media feeds. So this is also very insightful, and I think I'm definitely going to use it as well. And on your second comment regarding Cartesianism and how this could all be read from my perspective and the role of affect, I think that affect is one of the major categories which can help build a translational interface between animate and inanimate actors. And I'm saying this in the most literal sense I can. Actually, it's fun. It's funny that when I was talking about the same thing yesterday, and I was speaking about how we often have a very intimate relationship with our smartphone, and how we build a dependence on it, and we love it actually. I think one of the comments from the audience was that I get what you're getting at, but if you go too deep into thinking that love for objects is real, you're gonna end up in an asylum. And I think that, first of all, I think that we're all much closer to an asylum than people used to be when Heidegger was writing. So I think what's normal for us would probably be asylum worthy for Heidegger. But also, I think that this psychiatrization of these concepts doesn't help address the real issue, which is that all in all, and at the end of the day, we really do love our smartphones, even if they're inanimate. And I think affect is a very powerful category in trying to address these issues. I haven't delved into this yet, I think, but I would definitely like to in the future. So regarding Cartesianism, a very, very brief comment. I think that my whole enterprise is kind of anti-Cartesian. I don't think that Descartes would like it very much, even though he was kind of in love with his stove, I think, even though he doesn't admit it. He loved his stove very much. He mentions it all the time. So thanks a lot.
My pleasure. And in fact, about a Cartesian rereading or reverse reading of these issues or affect is more directed to Evrim's presentation, but it was also challenging to hear your thoughts about it. So I reflected to Evrim one more time, if you'd like to respond.
Thanks for your question, Emine. Oh, I never thought of the connection with Descartes before, but of course, I mean, what is obvious is both Deleuze and Descartes, both Deleuze and Bresciard would find Descartes still belonging to a, of course, Descartes belongs to this pre-Kantian area where the both mind and body, the substantiality of mind and body is merely presupposed, and how they are generated or how they are conditioned is not questioned. But Bresciard would probably ask how Deleuze differs from Descartes when it comes to the acceptance of the persistence of minds. And both for Descartes and Deleuze, either this is called an ego or minds or a pre-subjective field. Bresciard would accuse both of them for attributing minds or a pre-subjective field in the indestructibility and then immortality. Of course, they both do this in different ways. One with a naive pre-Kantian realism, and the other with a differential ontology. But the result would be the same. What Bresciard calls this hubris, with the spiritualization or the idealization of thinking. And for the effects, I didn't think of this as well before, but it makes me think of the Nietzsche demands for a different way of feeling for the overcoming of nihilism, and this for Deleuze, this different way of feeling necessitates the subordination of the horror of existence to the joy of affirmation. So the horror of existence that is produced after the death of God, that is produced by the abyss opens after the death of God, should be transformed into an enhancer of life. So this is Deleuze's strategy. This is how negation is subordinated to affirmation on an affective level. What Bresciard would say is such a subordination is impossible, but what we can do is to make the horror of existence an object of knowledge. So we can actually do an epistemology of horror, which is not going to be a subordination of horror to life, to joy. And this is something unthinkable within a Deleuzian framework, indeed. So this is the function of nihilism, or the will to nothingness for Bresciard. Nihilism and will to nothingness has the capacity to not only to feel or to make use of horror, but to know it. So this is the kind of different way of feeling maybe that we can find in Bresciard.
Okay, thank you so much.
Can I, Emin?
Yes.
Emin, can I ask something?
Yes, you do. Please go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, my question is to John, actually.
I was listening to his new theory of object, and it's really in relation to design practice. And I'm just curious about the distinction that you're following, especially the Heideggerian distinction between thing and object, especially in terms of so in the context of industrially produced objects and the new design practice. But the theory of object is slightly more a elaborate canvas, wherein which you have anthropology of objects. There are different fields of even Latour comes from the field of anthropology in that sense, like anthropology of science practices. But my question is that we're talking about hyper objects, technically produced or simulated objects. Others of I was thinking about a virus, like which is something people calls it as being. It cannot be called a being or a non-being, but of course I do know that like virus can be produced in laboratories and all those things, but otherwise if you think about virus as an object in that sense, how do you sort of address the question of thing object sort of dichotomy? It's quite easy to kind of fit into the to kind of explore the technological paradigm in the sense that like how do you kind of build a resistance against this sort of highly, like you say, sort of industrially produced objects and other stuffs, but it seems a little untenable in the larger canvas, I think so. How do you respond to that?
I want to say that my connection was lost for the last 10 seconds or so of your question, so you're going to have to repeat them.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay, fine. So I was asking about the virus was the example that I want to bring in, and sort of kind of connected with the distinction that you made between the thing and the object, and which was you following throughout your lecture as well, right? In order to kind of address the question of a technological object in design practice and all, if I am getting it correct, right? If I am making use of the virus as an example, which is like a sort of having a very complicated ontology, wherein which you cannot say it is whether it's a being or a non-being, right? So in that sense, like this distinction that you kind of bring in between sort of object and thing becomes slightly untenable, like, you know, because in a technical space, in a technological space, in a design practice, of course, it's absolutely perfect. But if you look at it in a larger canvas, the larger spectrum of philosophy of objects, then it becomes slightly untenable. So I just want to know how what's your response to that.
Okay, thank you. I got everything now. So, first of all, I feel like I have to distinguish myself from Heidegger. Well, in many in many fields, in many respects, but regarding to what we're talking now, I think that one thing that Heidegger thinks is very important in this distinction, and I was just trying to recreate that to show how problematic it is actually, is that of course he distinguishes everything in terms of being. So he thinks that objects and things have a very distinct, authentic being, a very distinct way with which they emerge or they're presented in the world. And I try to outline how this is problematic if we try to think about what authenticity means, if we try to put animate and inanimate actors on the same field, etc. So I follow this distinction of between object and thing mainly in order to stage my argument, which is that I believe the boundaries are getting blurrier and blurrier between objects and things. And if I'm allowed to say, I think that maybe these are all translational categories. You know, speaking in terms of clear objects or clear things is a way of not throwing in the trash the way we used to speak before the internet, before COVID, before things like that. So I'm kind of using them maybe, I don't know, it's kind of a vulgar use. It's a little bit, I use them like tools, but I'm not really getting deeper into them. So the issue of the virus, I suppose, is very interesting. I think that in terms of Timothy Morton, the virus is definitely a hyperobject. And I think that even if we expand a little bit on what Emine said before about the objectile and this dialectic I was improvising between hyperobject and objectile, I think that the virus also has this kind of existence. It functions like that a lot. It can at the same time be a pandemic, be ever present, omnipotent, etc. And at the same time, it is a very tiny speck of matter which can be said to exist or not exist at the same time. It's alive or it's not. Nobody really knows. It can be dissolved very easily if you can find it, that is. And I think that what is actually the most difficult to address is the issue you raised. Of course, it wasn't your central issue, but I think that this is the most difficult thing to answer, and I don't really have an answer to this, about being and non-being, things that are between being and non-being, and maybe even if non-being is an actual mode of which we can speak of. I think that Heidegger would argue that non-being is not real. You cannot really speak of non-being. It is devised of all these different categories, the death and the ground and etc. But I disagree with that. I think that nowadays we have to try and devise an ontology, not me, philosophers, try to devise an ontology regarding non-being, trying to think of non-being as something which actually exists, because we talk about it and it comes to the foreground all too often. So that was my answer. I hope I covered you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. I think we're already approaching to or exceeded the limits of our session time. So I would like to thank one more time to the organizers for this great event, eminent colleagues for this great afternoon for our time, and for their presentations, fruitful presentations and discussions. So we have done. Congratulations and applauses. And see you soon on the next session. Over to you, Manoj.
I just want to check whether Eva is still here. Hello, Eva.
It's there.
Hi.
Hi, Eva.
Yeah. Nice to meet you. So,
hello.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Am I supposed to start or?
No.
no,
Hello,
there will be
Eva.